Okay, good morning to everyone. Thank the organizer to have me here. I'm honored to be in such an interesting audience. What I'm going to present you in a short time is a joint paper with a colleague of mine. And let me introduce the paper by saying that if you study education, you must believe into an interdisciplinary approach. My colleague is a political scientist, and writing a paper with a political scientist being an economist is a nightmare. Starting from the easiest word, like for example, we as economists, we call descriptive and low quality paper, while political scientists consider a descriptive paper an important paper. And so, going that direction, you will easily recognize which slides are mine and which slides are by my co-author. But basically the idea is, suppose you want to explain cross-country variation in tertiary enrollment and tertiary attainment. If you're studying just one single country, you can find a reform, like yesterday we heard 3 papers which were using heterogeneity in treatment within a country. But if you want to compare countries, like animals, you need somehow to group them, like a zoologist, in order to find which are the regularities. So what we do here is we try to build a clustering of countries across Europe, and then we do study this cluster in terms of individual behavior using SILK data, which is a Eurostat survey which is conducted every year. We started this paper by simply reading the European Commission agenda. They are speaking about a European educational area, which is an empty word. In addition, they set a target by 2030, 45% of the relevant population should achieve a tertiary degree. But is there a convergence? Are the European educational system available to achieve such a target since they are so different? So we moved from that question, and we are basically using indicators of educational system. We mostly use OECD and UNESCO data in order to characterize and create this cluster. And then we use this cluster to differentiate the European countries. We speak about the youth transition education regime. The literature on regime is vast and go from sociologists to political scientists. Probably many of you are familiar with Joost Esping-Andersen welfare regime. Basically, regime is a structuring of different institutional dimensions that goes from family support to educational policies to success or support in the labor market. Strange enough, all the people who have been speaking about regime, they don't care about tertiary education. They go up to secondary, because tertiary is not a right, it's not an individual right, it's a choice. So speaking of a right to tertiary education doesn't make any sense. And this is why we fought in order to find a possible definition of what could be a regime. A regime basically is accomplishing 3 tasks. The first one, coming from sociology, is basically you need to recreate a social stratification. An educational regime allows for the selection of the elites. And this is accomplished in different ways, with greater or smaller equality of opportunity, but nevertheless, any educational system, when you go to the top of the system, has this task. Second, an educational regime should accomplish the increasing competitiveness of the country via the creation of skills in the labor force. And third, an educational regime also works in order to make democracy more effective. What characterizes, in our view, a transition from secondary to tertiary. There are school system features. Some of them have been mentioned yesterday, especially in the presentation over Portugal, like, for example, the level of spending, the fraction of students in vocational track. Then there is a problem of governance of the system, school autonomy. We will hear the next section about that. Then there is a specific dimension which is related to higher education organization. Do not forget that universities are autonomous in most of the European countries, and they can choose whatever policies they want in order to admit students. In addition, the government may introduce tuition or not financial aid to students. And finally, there are specific features of the country which are individual selection criteria, gender differential, native versus migrants, family background, and so on. Basically, we try to characterize, according to the existing literature and specific paper, 5 regimes. Italy and Portugal are together in what we call the familistic regime, together with Spain and Greece. There is a universalistic, the Nordic pattern. There is a continental Europe, an employment-oriented. There is a market-based organization. And finally, there are the post-communists, which are difficult to locate. You may use, the paper is 120 pages, you find a different table like this one, like, for example, do you have a tracking at the secondary level and tracking at tertiary level, and according to the way in which the two are organized, you get different transition rates. But let me go to the first bit of empirical analysis. Given what exists in the literature about regimes, do we find correspondence in the data? And what we do is basically we take a list of dimensions, 43 dimensions, which includes level of spending, enrollment, attainment, tracking age, duration of compulsory education, the existence of admission tests at different level, and we put all these variables together. How we do select the variable? Basically, we have an idea of the educational system, like, as an economist, I would call a vertically integrated system where the input of one stage are the output of the previous one. And if you see the educational system like that, you have a cohort entering the system, and this cohort sooner or later make a step of transition. At some point, someone is diverted outside, dropout rate, retention, and so on. Some other are diverted on different tracks, like vocational one, and finally there is a group reaching the top of the system. Within the system there are a lot of differentiation. For example, yesterday there was mentioned private and public, and so on. The level of spending is completely different, the involvement of the private sector. So how you can describe all of this? There is no strategy unless you are able to estimate a structural model. So we basically put all these variables together within the procedure, and we use factor analysis. Factor analysis basically reducing the size of the dimension to a lower number of dimensions. Here I'm selecting the first 2 dimensions, and I'm locating the country according to these 2 dimensions. You may think the vertical axis as a successful completion of tertiary education, and the horizontal axis like a catching up dimension where these countries are still catching up the upper stage of development. But what is interesting is that countries locates according to our theoretical expectation. You see, there are The Mediterranean are here. They are high on the second dimension and somehow weak on the first one. The Nordic countries are here, and what is interesting that the Baltic are very close to the Nordic. Even Slovenia, which is not geographically close to the Nordic country, tend to behave like a Nordic country. You have the continental Europe at the center, and the post-communist down here. We don't have in Europe so many Anglo-Saxon. Ireland goes with the continental, so we are left with UK and the Flemish part of Belgium. And this is one way of grouping the country. Another way is using cluster analysis, where these two methods are completely theoretical. They're simply telling you how the variables are distributed, and you find a similar kind of grouping. So we confirm by this exploratory analysis the idea that there are 5 clusters in Europe, which are listed here, and which we'll be using as a descriptor for the microdata analysis. We also compute what are the center of each cluster by using Euclidean distance. Sweden is the most representative country for the Nordic, Germany the most representative for the continental, Portugal for the Mediterranean, and Slovakia for the post-communist. The Anglo-Saxon are just 2. And here is the list of details of these representative countries. Now let me go to the validation of if this cluster makes sense, then we should observe a different behavior of the individual within this country. In order to do that, we do 2 validations. The first one is observing the educational choices of people, and this is what is done with validation 1. And the second one is using a public opinion poll in order to see whether the local population trust or don't trust the educational system, and what is their judgment about the educational system. The first one is using SILC. SILC means Standard of Income and Living Condition. Basically, it's a survey conducted at the household level. And for each individual in the family, you know what he or she is doing. Especially if you take the population between 0 and 30, you know whether he or she is in school, which kind of school is attending. And so you can study the probability of being in one stage or another. We use a 2019 survey, even though there is 2021, because every 4 years there is a special module on family background. Why is family background relevant? And here is the first difference between the countries. Because if you are studying the transition from secondary to tertiary, in the Mediterranean country, all the children are in the family. And so you can study the influence of the family within the individual choices. But if you go to Nordic, this is the fraction of people living at home by age. And you see the green line is the fraction of individual living age in the Nordic country. Basically, most of the people in the Nordic country here, there are colleagues from the Nordic country who may confirm or not, but most of them go out of the family. And if the family is one of the fundamental factor creating inequality of opportunity, just skipping out of the family is a way of solving the problem. You see that the post-communists behave in a similar way to the continental, while the other 2 are in the middle. This is the only formula I have. If I want to study G of t, which is the fraction of people completing tertiary education, there are 3 dimensions which are relevant. The first one is, suppose G of p is a fraction of population completing primary or compulsory, which typically is 100%, is close to 100%. Then you have alpha, which is the fraction of dropout during secondary education. So G of p times 1 minus alpha is a fraction of people completing secondary. Then you have a transition to tertiary, which is beta. And then a third problem, which is sometimes neglected, is that there is a huge fraction of people who do not complete tertiary. They drop out from tertiary. So you have 2 dropout rates and a transition rate, if you want to analyze. Here is the way in which the data appears in silk. Each bar gives you the distribution by age of the population. What we are interested is in the green area, which are the fraction of people who are at that point of their life enrolled in tertiary education. Here is the first graph. Here is the enrollment rate by cluster, by age of the individual, and by type of secondary school they have attended. As you do expect, those who have been attending a general academic track have a higher probability of being enrolled at university, but the distance between the lines in the different clusters are different, which means that even though you have tracking in your secondary education system, the impact of this tracking may limit or not limit the probability of go to the tertiary education. Here is the same, but not by type of secondary school you have attended, but by type of education of your parent. And so to speak, the distance between the 3 lines is a proxy of the extent of relevance of the parental background. Compare the Nordic with the Mediterranean. Even in the Nordic, having a graduated parent, at least one graduated parent, increases your probability of transition compared to a parent without secondary education. But the distance between the two, compared to what is in, look at here, this is the probability of going to college in a Mediterranean country if your father has a tertiary degree, compared to this one. And look at the post-communist as well. So the extent at which the family background matters in Nordic and post-communist is much higher than in the Nordic and in the continental. And if you take the ratio between the two, you get an extent, technically speaking, you may call this odds ratio, is the difference in probability of having a graduated father against, or a parent against the probability of having, while having a father with uncompleted secondary. You see, is 50% the advantage in the Nordic, 82% in the continental, against 110 in post-communist and 77 in the continental. You may ask, does money matter, especially for transition? Apparently, in the SILK data, it doesn't. Why? Probably because these home living differences. If you look, these are cohabiting children, which is one, those who are in the relevant age, between 18 and 25, who are still in the family. You see, in the Nordic country, there are no difference in probability depending on the point in the distribution of the household income, while in the Mediterranean, still money matters. If you are in the richest third of the distribution, you have a higher probability of transition. If you leave home, and here the population are different because in the Nordic these are the majority, in the Mediterranean these are a minority, but look at how strange is this line. If you are the poorest in the Nordic, you are more likely to be enrolled. This is probably the effect of the financial aid of the state in enrollment. I was mentioning you about dropping out during tertiary education. Here is a table from Education at a Glance. This is the completion rate after 4 years from start. I can estimate the completion rate by comparing the attainment and the enrollment. If there are no dropout rate during tertiary, after 4 years, the enrollment should map in the completion. If there is a difference, that is an estimate of the lack of completion. The time is going. Let me just show you another difference between the cluster. In the green are the enrollment rate, and the orange are the completion rate. As you notice, the enrollment in the relevant age 2021 are similar between the two, but then while in the Nordic people tend to complete, and therefore the line, the orange line, which is the, so to speak, the integral of the green line, is going up. So in the Nordic, almost 60% of the population complete tertiary. In the Mediterranean, they stop at 40. Basically because they don't complete tertiary education. In addition, in the Nordic, people keep on enrolling at the university even in the late 20s, while in the Mediterranean they stop. Okay, so if I have to summarize the finding, obviously behind these there are probit and order probit regressions, but if I have to summarize the finding about the determinants of educational choices, I would say that the institutional design matters, having the tracking and how the tracking is managed matter. There is the second dimension, which are the cultural resources of the individual, proxied by parental education. And there are also aspirations. In a regression, if you use parental occupation and parental income, parental occupation matters more than parental income, which means that depending on the social role of your parents, you have a pressure to perform, which is much higher than the money you may have in your family. Okay, the second validation is, what do people think in these countries about their educational system? We use different surveys, and let me just give you an idea. Here is, for example, a question taken from European Social Survey. Everyone in the country has a fair chance of achieving the level of education they seek. What do you expect? That in the Nordic country, the people trust their educational system. In the Mediterranean countries, people are aware that in order to achieve in education, you need a family support. And this is perfectly reflected in the opinion. This is the support to the statement in the Nordic country, which goes up to 80%. And this is the support to the statement in the Mediterranean countries by family income. So irrespective of what is the family income, people do trust where the system is working, and they don't trust, so they have rational, so to speak, rational expectation about their system. How important do you think for getting ahead in life having well-educated parents? Here you have a reverse of the situation. The Mediterranean countries are fully aware that you need a family support if you want to succeed in life, while in the Nordic country, people have the lowest support of the same statement. Another statement which is related to UK, basically they ask you, is it acceptable or not acceptable to have money to buy good education? People in the Anglo-Saxon, which is basically UK and Belgium, they are perfectly in a comfortable situation with the idea that money buys quality, because their educational system is organized in that way, while all the other Europeans are somehow concerned about this one. Finally, there is a problem, which is probably dealt by the next speaker, of suppose you have a given amount of the educational expenditure. How do you allocate this expenditure? Do you prefer to invest in tertiary or in childcare? And here is the priority within a country, again by income, and you see that for the Nordic country, the main concern sorry. The main concern is childcare and general education, while tertiary education is not, so to speak, the most relevant one. While for the Mediterranean, vocational education and general education, which is the stage at which their educational system are, is a priority. But here is even more clear. There was a question comparing childcare and tertiary education. There is a full reversal between Mediterranean and Nordic. The Nordic now are concerned about childcare more than tertiary, and the Mediterranean have the reverse preferences. The main conclusion of the paper is basically we think to have been able to characterize the European countries, to have been able to rank somehow them in terms of equality of opportunity in the transition from secondary to tertiary, and then you should go, but this I leave for the discussion, to policy proposal. Suppose you want to enforce or strengthen, especially if you are a Mediterranean country, the transition, also because you want to accomplish what the European Commission is asking, what should you do? And given what existing in the literature, basically what we do suggest is that you should increase the aptitude of people doing vocational education within this country toward generalist kind of content, because tertiary education is organized in that way. You should provide incentive and pathways in order not to be trapped in a dead-end pathway. And this is a policy proposal, and I feel comfortable to be in Portugal as an Italian. We should encourage home living. What are the policies? The policies are very expensive. You have to pay for children to go out and attend the university in another city. Student hall facilities, canteens, and whatever should probably ease this kind of transition. You can use scholarship and bursaries in order to support poor students in this transition, but it's more a cultural fight than a money fight. And then you have also to support these students during their tertiary career. Why? Because we have seen that the dropout rates during tertiary education is a problem, up to 50%. So the problem is not inducing expectation, but the problem is more to support them. Thank you.